Good morning. It's just gone 11, so we will start the presentation now. I can still see a few people coming in, so for the first couple of minutes, I'll just take you through what this presentation is about, the brief history of Dan at Advanced Invasives, a couple of housekeeping rules on how to use the system, and then I will hand over to Dan, by which time hopefully most people will have logged in and we'll be ready to go. So thank you very much for joining us on our second in a series of ICL and Advanced Invasives webinars on the presentations of invasive weed species. I can see that we've got a fair few people registering and joining, and it's still growing as we speak. A lot of you attended the first webinar and have joined us for a second, so thank you very much. And it's also quite nice to see that we've also got new attendees here today as well. So apologies if the next couple of bits are going over old ground for those that attended before, but we'd like to keep everyone up to speed so everyone knows how to use the system and knows who they're listening to. Also to point out that the first webinar, if you've seen it or if you wish to catch up, if you hadn't joined it and you're joining us for the first time today, the video can be found on Vimeo. We'll be sending out a link following this on email with basis registration points, because this is basis accredited and you can get basis points for this, and a link to the Vimeo website on knotweed will be on there as well. So today's presentation by Dr. Dan Jones is managing herbaceous invasive plants and their seed banks, and it'll be focusing on giant hogweed and Himalayan balsam, and is again being presented by Dr. Dan Jones. For those of you that don't know, Dr. Dan is Managing Director of Advanced Invasives, a consultancy founded in 2016 to bring evidence-led thinking to the commercial management of invasive plants. Dan specializes in the detection, mapping, and sustainable management of invasive plants, and also holds an honorary researcher in the Department of Biosciences at Swansea University. Now, before we hand over to Dan, like I said, there's a couple of ways to use this system to allow you to focus more cleanly on the presentation itself, but also to give you the ability to ask questions. So on your screens now, you'll see both myself and Dan in all our glory, but you'll also see the presentation that I've got in front of me, and I'll hand over to Dan shortly. At the top of that screen, you will see three little lines on the grey bar. If you click and drag on that line, you'll be able to resize the presentation and the videos accordingly. So you can have the focus on solely presentation, or if you wish, you can watch myself and Dan in the background while Dan presents, but it allows you to resize it as you go. You also have the ability, like I said, to ask questions at any point. If you click on the corner of the screen, you'll see a little question box. You can type your questions into there. They'll pop up. I'll answer as many as I can to let you know that I've acknowledged them. And at the end of the presentation, we will have a Q&A session between myself and Dan, and I'll try and get through as many questions as I can in the time allowed. If we run out of time and we don't get through everyone's questions, myself and Dan will have a video session after this, and we will cover off everyone's questions in that. And again, that will be posted subsequently via video link, probably on Vimeo. But again, everyone that's registered and attended today will get a link to that. So apologies if we don't get to your questions. We'll try and get as many covered as we can, but obviously this is quite a complex subject, but we will cover them off and we'll follow them up later on. So feel free to ask any questions you wish. Like I said, I'll collate them, and at the end, we'll get through as many as we can. So without any further delay, gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Dan Jones and his presentation on managing herbaceous invasive plants. I will hand over control to Dan, and I will let him present from now. Thank you very much, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks for the introduction, Barry. So today it's a bit of a different focus from what I'm normally presenting on, and certainly what I was presenting in the last webinar. So we're taking a look at invasive plants that are primarily their long-term persistence in the environment, and also their dispersal is very much down to their seed bank. And this includes a wide range of different invasive species. Japanese knotweed is actually quite unique in the fact that it spreads primarily by rhizome. And we'll just take a look at how that affects the management options that we've got available for these species. For those of you that don't know, Aquatic Invasives is a consultancy that focuses on solving invasive plant problems. And today we'll be looking at a bit of our R&D work, some strategy, continuing professional development, and also public guidance work that we undertake. In terms of who we are and what we do, we've got a consulting offer, Advanced Invasives, and also our R&D offer, AI Lab. And all of this is based on the research that I undertook as part of my PhD, field trial studies with Swansea University and complete weed control. And over the years, we're getting the evidence that we find with our R&D and also our academic research out into the public domain. And the kind of key paper that we've got out most recently is the knotweed paper, but we've got some updates to both the knotweed research and other species coming out this year. So in terms of plant functional approach, or selecting plant functions in order to better manage invasive plants in the environment, there's an importance of plant life history. And in the last webinar, what we were looking at is how the rhizome system and control of that system is fundamental to getting good control and management following the application of glyphosate-based herbicides. That rhizome.
Dan, sorry, Dan, can I just interrupt? So we're having a problem with the screen. We've just got a white screen on the presentation.
One moment.
Do you want to have a go at reloading that screen? There you go. So do you want to go back? We'll go through it.
Yeah,
we just had a white screen for a little while.
No problems.
Apologies to everyone, but thanks for pointing that out.
Thank you. Yeah, so briefly, we solve invasive plant problems. Today we'll be looking at research and testing, strategy, CPD, and also public guidance. We're quite unique as a consultancy in that our work and what we produce for our clients is evidence-based. There's an academic element to that, but also a commercial element as well. And quite uniquely, what we find, we publish in the public domain. And that fundamentally informs both of our consulting offer and also the continuing R&D that we undertake, principally down at our Tafts well site. So in terms of what we've been discussing in previous webinars, Japanese knotweed has got this extensive below ground biomass, the rhizome system, and this rhizome system and control and management of that system is really important in terms of managing Japanese knotweed in the environment. Now, with other invasive plants, the seed bank is this long-lasting system or kind of persistent part of the plant that lasts much longer than the above ground growth. And understanding what this system is and how best to manage it is really important in terms of getting good control and management, but also potentially eradication of these species, certainly at the local scale. So in terms of what we'll be looking at today, we're going to take a look at Himalayan balsam, which is an annual, and we're also going to take a look at giant hogweed, which is a monocarpic species, so it flowers once and it dies. Himalayan balsam is actually Indian balsam, confusingly. I'll stick to Himalayan balsam throughout this presentation just for clarity and consistency. But in terms of how this species has spread throughout the UK, what we can do to manage it, the fundamentals of balsam, its spread in the environment, are pretty similar, and they also include two other species. So similarly to Japanese knotweed, it's a species complex. There's a number of different species that have been introduced into the UK, and you can see at the left there, small balsam from Central Asia, and also orange balsam, which can also be problematic in certain settings from North America. In terms of Himalayan balsam and the other invasive balsams, they're horticultural introductions, and this is a recurring theme throughout invasion biology. As the name suggests, it's from the Western Himalayas, and it was introduced into the UK in 1839 by Victorian plant hunters. In terms of its growth, it's similarly to knotweed. It's a tall plant. It grows up to 3 meters tall in Europe, but it's importantly, it's an annual species. So The seed set germinates, it produces seedlings, they attain full height in one growing season, produces seed, and then dies back at the end of the growing season. In terms of its growth, similarly again to knotweed, it's got this it's hollow stem, it's quite efficient in its above ground growth, and it produces a lot of leaves. So between rapid growth and high leaf production, this is how it shades out native plant species. In terms of the flowers, we'll take a look at them in a moment, but you've got pink, purple and white flowers, depending on the population that you're looking at. In terms of the flowering, you're looking from June to November, depending on the weather. And in terms of the root system, when you compare this to Japanese knotweed, it's quite a shallow rooting, fleshy, adventitious root system. So it's not nearly as extensive and deep as the rhizome system of Japanese knotweed. To give you an idea of what balsam looks like in the field, you can see flowering balsam plants at left there, and you can see the kind of serrated leaves of the balsam plant at the top left. In terms of the flowers, they look quite superficially similar to snapdragons, so they're quite different to knotweed and giant hogweed flowers. The seeds are produced in large numbers on each plant, and you can see the seed capsules up at the top right there, and those they actually explode on contact, so they're able to spread the seeds quite far away from the parent plant. In terms of the seed rain or the production of seeds that fall to the ground, there's a lot of them, and I think that image down at the bottom right illustrates this quite well. That seed bank produces a lot of germinating seedlings early in the growing season, and it demonstrates how much of a seed bank is below ground, and you just can't see that. In terms of the root system, this image from a conservation group near Warwick highlights how shallow the root system is. They've been hand pulling the balsam plants out on the site, but it also highlights that when we apply herbicides to annual species like Himalayan balsam, we can kill the above and the below ground parts of the plant, frequently with a single herbicide application, and that differs really substantially from what we find with repeat herbicide applications to species like knotweed. So in terms of balsam, it's a garden escape, and it's shown rapid spread along watercourses in particular and colonising areas of damp ground. But additional to that now is that it's spreading out from those initial routes of invasion into much drier conditions, parkland, and where it's not managed, it spreads quickly. In terms of the seed production, you're looking at between 5 and 20 seeds per pod, and each of those pods can explode and spread those seeds up to 5 meters away from the parent plant. Now, in terms of the seed production per plant, you're looking at around 2,500 seeds, and that's a huge number of seeds, really. And when you think about how densely packed those balsam plants are in situ, it's a lot of seed that's going to be remaining in the ground for up to, well, 2 to 3 years, although the evidence underpinning that is a bit patchy. To give you an idea of just how rapid the spread of balsam can be in riparian settings, this is the Taswell site. The first image at top that you can see there is in August 2015, and that was after about 3 years of knotweed treatment. So we'd removed a lot of the above ground biomass using glyphosate-based herbicides, and very, very quickly, isolated pockets of Himalayan balsam began producing a lot of seed and spread throughout the site. And you can see this in the foreground of that image, going right back to the bottom of the site. In the following growing season, in June, that carpet of green that looks a bit like grass from a distance is actually Himalayan balsam seeds. So in the course of 2 to 3 years, a 5-hectare site was absolutely filled with Himalayan balsam, presenting a secondary invasion process that needed to be dealt with. When we look at Himalayan balsam management, often we get this impression that it's going to be a few isolated plants in situ. And in those sort of settings, we should be looking at physical management methods perhaps. But when we look at scale, managing Himalayan balsam at scale, it becomes quite apparent that those kind of methods really don't scale up, and management of balsam, although it's quite relatively easy to kill compared to Japanese knotweed, it becomes a scale dependent process. In terms of how widely and how rapidly balsam can spread, this image is quite useful in demonstrating the kind of volume of seed that's going to be removed from the site. So this image is from February 2020, and if you think about the number of seeds that are going to be present in the soil prior to this flood event, it kind of gives you an idea of just how many seeds are going to be spread following flooding. And in this particular case, you've got a lot of scouring of the ground, and certainly you're going to be estimating upwards of millions of seeds being spread down the River Taff following the February 2020 flooding events. To give you an idea of the broad coverage of the different invasive balsam species in the UK, you can see here that the Himalayan balsam in Impatiens glandulifera is by far the most well distributed throughout the UK. But you can see that small balsam and also orange balsam are beginning to take a foothold in the UK, particularly in the southeast of England. In terms of Himalayan balsam, the impacts and control costs, there's a range of ecological impacts. So you've got direct shading of native plant species. This has an indirect impact on terrestrial food webs, and also a direct impact on freshwater food webs, because it alters the litter quality of the plant material going into the streams during the winter months. In terms of the socio-economic impacts, you've got a direct impact on erosion risk, and certainly in terms of activities like angling, access to riverbanks invaded by balsam can be difficult. In terms of the control costs, we're looking at around £1 million per year, but this is likely to be a significant underestimate of the true spend on balsam management at the UK scale. In terms of the erosion risk of Himalayan balsam, this image and the following image really do highlight what the issue is around this. So this is full growth Himalayan balsam in the summer months, and at this point in the growing season, it's going to be excluding a lot of the native plant species grown along riverbanks. When you fast forward to the winter months, once that Himalayan balsam growth has died back down, you can see how the riverbanks are going to be prone to erosion, and Himalayan balsam doesn't bind the soil together as effectively as a lot of native plant species found in such settings would do. In terms of current best practice for Himalayan balsam, there is no one overarching document for managing balsam, and there's a range of different methods that are proposed as being effective for its management. Now, before I get started on these, it is worth bearing in mind that these methods will kill individual Himalayan balsam plants. The problem is, can they be sustained long enough that you can actually achieve local eradication or effective control and management? So just taking a look at the physical methods, we've got pulling, cutting, but both of these, it's important that all operations are undertaken before seed set. So mid to late summer at the latest. Biological control includes things like grazing. Grazing can be effective for Himalayan balsam management, but again, you've got to think about stocking for multiple years. And in terms of the biocontrol that's presently available, this doesn't seem to be working for a range of different reasons for Himalayan balsam. In terms of the chemicals that are available for Himalayan balsam, certainly early in the season, there are a range of products that are very, very effective for managing balsam in situ. One of the key things that I want to take away from this presentation is that residual products are also highly effective for balsam management. In terms of the application methods that are recommended for controlling balsam, foliar spray and weed wiper can be very practical, but I would mention that really foliar spray, particularly along riverbanks, is going to be the only effective practical method that you're going to be able to use. In terms of the integrated weed management systems, there aren't many recommended, and certainly not as a a process series that can underpin effective management. And coming back to this seed bank, the long-lasting part of the life cycle, whatever you're going to do, it's going to have to be in situ, in place for at least 2 to 3 years in order to manage that seed bank and deplete it to the point that you're not going to have any germinating seedlings coming through in subsequent treatment seasons. So to give you an idea of where things are currently at with respect to management of Himalayan balsam, this particular example that I'm going to provide is a nature conservation area in South Wales, and it's a wetland area in Swansea City and County. And you can see in these two images how at present it's relatively uninvaded by Himalayan balsam. The problem is that this particular site is that the owners and those involved in its management don't really want to use herbicides. So at present, there's quite large volunteer groups that do a great job pulling out balsam in certain areas of the site, and they do pull out a large volume of balsam. But the problem is that all of that labour, all of that time is going into very limited areas, and over time the Himalayan balsam is spreading from the initial areas of introduction, growing along the footpaths, the boardwalks that you can see at left there, and it's forming new patches of balsam that are becoming increasingly difficult to get on top of, and there's simply not enough volunteer time in order to manage the balsam populations effectively. And as a consequence of that, you can see it right where the Himalayan balsam is now beginning to invade the wetland areas. So it's a real problem, and certainly when it comes to just using physical methods, it's very difficult to stay on top of that volume of balsam. Just to give you an idea of the numbers that kind of underpin the contention that management of balsam at scale is going to be really difficult, we took a look at how long it took to manage Himalayan balsam using a range of different methods at our field trial site. And what we were looking at is looking at how we could improve the sustainability of Himalayan balsam generally and the management of it, but also take a look at how, because sustainability isn't just about using less herbicides, it's doing things in an economically sustainable way that we can achieve our stated goals. So where we look at methods that aren't going to be effective, or that's one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is, can we maintain those methods for long enough that we can control, manage, or potentially eradicate a population in situ? So in terms of what we are looking at here, we are directly addressing this issue of people not really wanting to use herbicides, particularly on nature conservation areas. But we did understand that there was going to be a lot of time invested by volunteer groups and organisations in undertaking these physical methods. So we wanted to see how long these methods would take, and then do some comparisons with some of the methods that we can use using either herbicides or other equipment. So we were looking at the time taken to either undertake hand pulling, cutting, strimming, or spraying on a 25 square metre area of full growth Himalayan balsam by one person, and we timed how long it would take to undertake these management operations. And you can see at the left there, hand pulling, you're looking at 60 minutes per person per plot. Hand cutting took 50 minutes, strimming 6.5, and spraying 3.5. Now, when you just look at that small area, you think, well, you know, that's doable. In a day, we could manage our patch of Himalayan balsam using those methods. But as soon as you start scaling it up, it looks increasingly difficult to manage Himalayan balsam at scale. And this is scaled up to the hectare level, again, for one person to undertake these different operations. And you can see that hand pulling and cutting, you're looking at 8 to 10 weeks to undertake that over 1 hectare. Now, thinking back to the field trial site, that's 5 hectares. So it would take a year to manage Himalayan balsam once. And frequently, Himalayan balsam can require up to 3 to 4 herbicide treatments to achieve effective control and prevent flowering in a given season. So it's just completely impractical for managing Himalayan balsam at that kind of scale. And then you can see down at the bottom there, strimming with a brush cutter, and spraying, you're looking at about a week. So it would be possible to manage using strimming, but I think really when we're looking at effective applications and also the use of residual products to reduce the number of visits, you know, hand pulling, hand cutting, those type of operations, they really don't present themselves as being practically feasible. There's other elements of this as well. So when you're strimming or treating with herbicide, you leave the dead material in situ over the winter months. So it protects the soil, and this means that high rainfall during the winter months aren't going to wash the topsoil away. When you look at the kind of what are often proposed as being environmentally friendly options, so hand cutting and hand pulling in particular, you're disrupting the soil structure, you're removing the material from where you're pulling it out from, and this leaves pockets and areas of bare soil that are going to be exposed to a greater erosion risk during the winter months. So this idea of sustainability, there's a lot of different elements to it, and it's worth considering all of those as you develop your management strategy. In terms of other species, the management of the seed bank is fundamental. Giant hogweed is another really good example of this. Giant hogweed is also a complex of species. It's by far the most common of them. So you've also got Persian hogweed and Sosnowski's hogweed as well. But in terms of their overall management, we're looking at seed bank depletion. So getting rid of the seed bank in order that you can locally remove the population. Giant hogweed is another horticultural introduction from, in this case, from Southwest Asia, it's the Caucasus Mountains, and again, Victorian introduction in 1893. It does differ a bit from Himalayan balsam in being a perennial, and however, both species can be killed with a single application of herbicide, which make them again different from Japanese knotweed. Again, this species has got hollow stems that grow rapidly, allowing it to overtop competitors, and it's got very large dark green leaves that are deeply lobed and have deep incisions and spiked ends. In terms of its flowering, once giant hogweed has accumulated enough biomass below ground in the taproot, it enables it to produce a flower, and once it's flowered once, it dies. So again, it sets it apart from Japanese knotweed, which is going to be in situ for a very long time. It's a perennial, long-lived perennial species. So giant hogweed is a monocarp. It's slightly different in terms of its overall growth strategy to Himalayan balsam, but we can kill both the adult plants and also the germinating seedlings. To give you a bit of an idea of what giant hogweed looks like, it's a huge plant, and you can see this at the left here. The leaves are large and it's very tall in stature. In terms of what the leaves look like, there's a bit of detail of a first year plant there, and also the seedlings at the top left and top right. And you can see the dead flower heads down at the bottom there. Once they've gone over, once they've flowered, set seed, those plants die. This image gives you an idea of the taproot form and structure, but you can see from this image, it is nowhere near as extensive as the rhizome system of knotweed, which enables us to control, manage and kill these species much more easily. In terms of the spread and dispersal of giant hogweed, similarly to Himalayan balsam, it's a garden escape, and there's been rapid spread along watercourses and colonization of damp ground and wasteland. But again, it's spreading out from those initial areas of colonization. In terms of the seed production, it's massive per plant. You're looking at anywhere between 20 to 100,000 seeds per plant. So it just illustrates that if you miss one of these plants, it goes over to flowering, it creates another series of issues that are going to require management. Direct dispersal, again, is up to around 5 meters away from the plant, but if it's growing near a watercourse, that spread is going to be far greater. In terms of the germination, it is largely restricted to early season, whereas Himalayan balsam shows repeated flushes. But quite different from Himalayan balsam, is the seed bank's viable anywhere between 7 to 15 years, and the data on that remain unclear. To give you an idea of the current extent of giant hogweed in the UK, it's extensive, and I would argue as well that the Persian knot hogweed and also Sosnowski's hogweed, those are likely to be underreported in the UK level because identification of the different species is quite problematic. So in terms of the impacts and control costs around giant hogweed, it's quite unique amongst the invasive plants that we've got in the UK in terms of its direct impacts on human health. So the sap contains toxic chemicals, and these cause blistering and photodermatitis. So they're quite significant chemical burns from coming into contact with the sap, and this causes problems principally when we're out on site. If people apply things like brush cutters to management of species like giant hogweed. In terms of the direct impacts of it on the ecology, the dense leaf production and large height of the plant shades out native species, and it can have indirect impacts in terms of native vertebrates that are preying on locally abundant invertebrate prey. In terms of the socio-economic impacts, they are quite similar to balsam in that it increases riverbank erosion risk, and it also has an impact on recreation and landscape. Again, the control costs are likely to be an underestimate at around £2.4 million per annum. In terms of current best practice for giant hogweed, there's a range of different methods proposed again. Root cutting has been demonstrated in various different publications and also presentations has been of limited efficacy, and if you miss the taproot or there's any connection remaining, the plant recovers to previous growth. In terms of cutting, we really wouldn't recommend that using any method. It's likely to be ineffective. The evidence isn't quite clear on that, but you've got this issue of spreading sap and coming into contact with that sap. In terms of the biological control, grazing has been recommended for these species, but certainly from what I've read quite recently, livestock can become affected by the sap, and it really should be avoided. There's no biocontrol currently available for giant hogweed, but there are again a range of different herbicides recommended for controlling it, and these include glyphosate, synthetic auxins, and also sulfonyl urea herbicides, so things like Lockstar. In terms of the application methods, again, there's a wide range of recommended application methods, but certainly in most settings, we're going to be looking at foliar spray using knapsack spray. There's also a recommendation for stem injection, and I can't see the value in this. And again, you're more likely to come into contact with sap, and there's health and safety issues associated with that. But whatever you're doing, you're going to have to get on top of the seed bank, this long, potentially very long-lasting seed bank of giant hogweed when you're managing this out in the field. So in terms of what we're looking at here, is targeting life history events with the right treatments at the right time. So with your knotweed, it's timing late in the season with the right herbicide to minimize regrowth from this long-lasting rhizome biomass. In contrast with these species, what we're looking at is, where possible, preventing germination, or certainly preventing flowering and setting of seed in the area of operation. I think it's worth considering what exactly eradication, control and management are. I think there's a misconception that eradication is what we should always be aiming for with all invasive plants. Now, in certain cases, so knotweed, removal of all reproducing individuals of a population is going to be very, very difficult. But when we think about balsam in particular, this is absolutely a goal that we can achieve. And control and management, by stretching that out, we're actually reducing the sustainability of management if we can completely remove a population in situ, particularly using herbicides in a sustainable way. That means that we are acting in a sustainable way overall. And I think ultimately, if we can do more with less, we can use less CO2, and we can demonstrate good results to our clients, we can manage these plants in a much more effective and sustainable way for the benefit of not only the environment, but wider society. In terms of integrated pest management, integrated weed management, control is the kind of method or series of methods that we apply as a last resort. We've already gone through the issues around prevention, monitoring, and setting action thresholds, and we really need to do something about invasives. So in terms of how we look at this, we need to think about what works and why, and also take into account the cost effectiveness of our operations. If we are able to cost effectively over a 3 to 15 year seed bank longevity, or understanding that knotweed isn't going to be knocked out with a single application, we can better manage and cost eradication, control and management projects going forwards. So in terms of what we should be doing with the annual monocarpic, so single flowering species, is always follow the law and client requirements. I'm discussing the use of residual products, and we can't use those near water in particular. But certainly in terms of use in triple SIs and other nature conservation areas, LERAPs may be required, and you need to get in touch with the relevant statutory body in those cases. In terms of the treatment timing, what we're looking at here is getting in early because we can use lower doses of herbicide to manage much smaller seedlings than later in the season when the plants have acquired a lot more above ground biomass and they're more difficult to kill. Crucially, understand how long that seed bank is going to be there. If you can explain this to a client and work through the various treatment methods available at your disposal, you can do more with less, and you can also potentially, with these species, achieve local eradication. In terms of the herbicide selection, labour is going to be the largest component of a long-term invasive species management plan. And I think, broadly speaking, certainly when you're getting on top of the issue at first, physical methods in the case of Himalayan balsam should be avoided. With respect to giant hogweed, they should be avoided full stop. But there's also a way of reducing the costs associated with managing these plants away from water by using residual products, because the number of site visits is reduced relative to using products like synthetic auxins and glyphosate. In terms of the best treatment methods, under most circumstances, foliar spray is going to be your go-to application method. But weed wiping, I have seen examples of weed wiping being quite useful. And just, I think with this, the real take-home message is to avoid labour-intensive physical methods, and particularly things like hand pulling. In terms of the coverage and dose, apply during active growth, particularly with synthetic auxins, at the label application rate. And when you're talking about good coverage with these species, it's getting good coverage of particularly the germinating seedlings. There is a note with this. When I've been managing these plants, certainly down on the Tass well site, late season applications of herbicides need to be at the full application rate. Once they get beyond sort of mid-season, the plants are big, and managing using herbicides, particularly synthetic auxins, they can recover from a sublethal dose. And they can go over to flowering. They seem to speed that process up because of the stress response. In terms of using the E word, eradication, it can be achieved at the local scale. And really think about where possible. I appreciate there's difficulties with landowners and neighbours, but work from the top down of the river catchment. And this enables you to get on top of things in a coordinated way. So thinking about this in terms of eradication, control and management, the really important thing here is prevent flowering and establishment. Once your problem goes over to seeding, you've missed your opportunity to manage it in that year. When you think that it's going to be quite a long-term process, certainly 3 years, if not longer, with giant hogweed, your management decisions need to be effective but also efficient. And Cost is a really big component of your decision making in this, because with the greatest will in the world, you may want to achieve eradication, but if your budget runs out or volunteers disappear between starting the strategy and the end of the strategy, you're not going to achieve your stated goals. In this case, using the right herbicides is using the products to reduce your labour component. So this makes your overall treatment strategy more sustainable by definition. And although I mentioned here that dose is probably one of the smallest considerations in this, particularly when you're managing seedlings, ultimately later in the season, you've got to think about what dose you're going to use in order to achieve kill of above ground biomass. In terms of long-term treatment then, just a key focus on this, make sure you know how long the seed bank is viable, because this is how you plan a treatment strategy. Minimise your site time by avoiding time-consuming physical control treatments, and particularly from the outset. Later, you can potentially introduce physical treatments, particularly for balsam, but certainly if you're managing large areas of balsam, getting on top of it with herbicides provides an economically sustainable advantage over time-consuming physical methods. In terms of Himalayan balsam and giant hogweed, you may require repeat applications of herbicide throughout the growing season. Certainly in my experience, we've had anywhere up to 3 or 4 flushes through the growing season, depending on the weather, that have successfully gone over to seed in the case of Himalayan balsam. In terms of integrated weed management, there's this often ignored component of it, and that's the economic sustainability. So if you can integrate residual products away from water into the overall treatment strategy, reducing your costs, you're increasing the sustainability of control, and you're increasing the likelihood that you're going to achieve good control and management, or potentially local eradication. And I think residual products really are something that are underused in the amenity sector generally, and certainly for the management of invasive plants. Ultimately, it's about doing more with less. And I showed this slide with the knotweed presentation, but we can do more with less, and that achieves greater benefit for the environment, and it also achieves better and more sustainable results for society and wider society at the same time. So to summarize sustainable control, if you come to the situation where you've got flowers that you can see it right, you've probably missed your chance. So use the right tools for the job. Think about which treatments will work best using the least herbicide and labour. That last point is really important. Minimise the use of physical methods and herbicides over the treatment cycle. Now, ultimately, what you want to be doing is reducing your overall costs and delivering more. Target the seed bank, prevent successful germination using residual products, and then you've got a job of spot treating rather than repeat applications over large areas. Target the seedlings where possible, so plants that are less susceptible to herbicide treatments early in the growing season. So start early to reduce overall herbicide use. In certain settings, improve foliar glyphosate efficacy using adjuvants and water conditioners, and where possible, demonstrate excellent results and work across the fence where possible. If you've demonstrated local eradication, it's much easier to sell to neighbouring landowners, and it's easier to sell success and demonstrate how the linking up and working together can deliver more. I'm happy to take any questions that you have.
Thank you very much, Dan. Appreciate your time and effort. I personally found that very interesting. I hope everyone else did too. As we mentioned, we've had a few questions in throughout the presentation, Dan. So if I can scroll through these, we will get underway. So let's have a look here. Right, okay, so the first question from John Handley. Apologies if I don't say your name or some of the questions correctly. I'm reading on the fly. But many of Schedule 9 plants are aquatic. Do you have any specific recommendations for aquatic non-native invasive species, please?
It's very, very difficult, in short, to manage those species. Certainly in terms of expertise, I primarily focus on terrestrial invasives. Jonathan Newman is a very good contact if you want specific advice on management of in-water aquatics. I can certainly provide advice in the sense that Roundup Pro Vantage with top film is recommended on the product label for aquatic emergence, so that includes invasive aquatics. But certainly in terms of there are other options as well in terms of management of aquatic invasives. There's been dyes to block out sunlight. One of the plants that I do have a little bit of experience with is Crassula. Certainly with respect to Crassula, I've heard of so I'm trying not to use the product name. Hot foam has been applied quite unsuccessfully for the management of Crassula. I've heard of it being covered. That's relatively ineffective. I think Yorkshire Water have done some research on it, and I've seen the publication, and I'm of the understanding that herbicides are far more effective than any of the other alternatives proposed for managing Crassula, certainly at any kind of scale. But that isn't really my area of expertise.
Okay, thank you very much. Question from Chris Swan. Does Himalayan balsam affect the soil? So even after successful control, are there difficulties for native plants in re-establishment? Is mechanical control, i.e. cutting, or chemical control a better option for follow-up establishment?
In my experience with using a range of different methods, so this is something that goes across. So my PhD students looking at restoration, passive. So there's two elements to it. There's your passive recolonization following removal of your primary invasive plant. There's passive recolonization following any removal of secondary invasives. So using the example of the field trial site, once the Japanese knotweed was gone, or I say gone, and the above ground growth was removed, there was actually an increase in native species diversity. There was then a decline in native species diversity as the Himalayan balsam shaded out the native plant species. So now we're getting on top of the Himalayan balsam. There's again an increase in native plant species diversity. So to address the question more directly, it doesn't make a great deal of difference what treatment that you're using. So for just using the example of glyphosate, glyphosate doesn't last long in the soil, certainly at the application rates that we're using it, the regularity that we're using it. So it doesn't really affect reseeding, germination from either the seed bank or introduced native species that have come in on the wind. So in short, whether you're using physical treatments or chemical treatments isn't the key thing. The key thing is getting rid of the invasive plants. And when this comes back to this issue of sustainability, rather than focus too much on the methods, focus on their effectiveness and efficiency. Because if you're not getting rid of the invasive plants, you're not only going to end up in the same position that you were in before, but you're not going to have that return of native biodiversity.
Okay, another one from John Handley. You mentioned applying herbicide in a riparian situation. Presumably this requires the explicit consent of the EA.
Depending on where you're based, Natural Resources Wales, in Wales, obviously, an Environment Agency in England, and I think it would be separate in Scotland. So yeah, and this is a good question. I mean, Himalayan. Well, I suppose, so you've got Himalayan balsam is frequently found in riparian areas. So yeah, that needs to be considered. In terms of the slides, you really need to figure that out before you start your control program using herbicides. I mean, it is found elsewhere as well now. So it is worth considering before you start your program. Yeah, you need to follow the law.
Okay, brilliant. Couple of questions here. I don't have the name on this one, apologies. Are there any examples that you have that show local eradication of Himalayan balsam or giant hogweed is possible?
Two really good examples. So Alan Abel, who's one of the directors of Complete Weed Control, is involved with the Wyenusk Foundation in South Wales, and they've done a really, really good job with giant hogweed management along the Usk. And there's Gethin Bowes, who is Invasive Plant Officer for Caerphilly County Council, again in South Wales, and he's managed giant hogweed, Himalayan balsam, but also crucially a lot of Japanese knotweed. And he's managed that using herbicides for more than 10 years and has achieved local, what could be termed local eradication of both giant hogweed and Himalayan balsam at scale.
Okay, question from Tim Bird. What conditions suit seed germination for these plants, such as scarification?
Himalayan balsam needs a chilling over the winter months, so that is what allows germination to proceed in successive growing seasons. Giant hogweed, as I understand it, it doesn't require a chilling, and certainly the dried seeds that I've used in the past, they're collected from the plant or nearby to the plant, and then they just germinate once they're planted again in the soil in the following growing season.
Okay, question from Peter Fitzsimmons. You mentioned the value of residuals to help avoid herbicide resistance. Is there any evidence for Himalayan balsam or giant hogweed or an INNS exhibiting such resistance?
Certainly, with respect, and it's a good question. So when I was writing up the knotweed paper, there was a lot of concern about knotweed developing resistance to glyphosate. Now, knotweed is a clonal species. It's all, certainly with respect to japonica, just Japanese knotweed, it's basically all one plant. So it's not got a lot of genetic diversity. And additional to that, because you're not killing the plant, there's no selection pressure on the population. There's no resistance development. In contrast with things like giant hogweed and Himalayan balsam, they're producing a lot of seeds, they're reproducing sexually. So there's variation in the seedlings that are being produced. And there is a risk of resistance development in those populations.
Okay, I think this one leads on again. Apologies, I didn't grab your name. Residual herbicides are expensive. Are there real advantages to using them?
This was one of the things that I was discussing earlier, is that labour is one of the key components of any invasive species management plan. And if you can reduce the amount of labour by reducing the number of site visits, using products like Lockstar, it enables you to increase the economic sustainability of your management plan.
Thank you. Question from Brian Taylor. Dan, I understand giant hogweed to typically flower between 3 and 5 years. Why not 2?
It depends on rise. This is another good question. I'll be completely open with you. The literature on Himalayan balsam and giant hogweed it misses bits. So I've seen from 2 to 7 years as being the time required for the taproot to develop enough below ground biomass that it can produce the large flower spike. So I would assume, and it is just an assumption, that depending on growing conditions, depending on a whole variety of factors, the quicker that the taproot can develop biomass, produce the above ground growth, the quicker the flowering period. There might be climatic elements to this as well, because there seems to be differences between the UK and mainland Europe as well, in terms of the length of time that it takes to come to flowering.
Okay. Eradication is all well and good, but what happens when a neighbouring property owner doesn't want to do anything about invasive plants, or you simply cannot find or contact them? Apologies, I didn't grab the name for this one.
It's difficult, but the example of the kind of, if we aim towards eradication and we better understand the length of time that we're going to be so once we're developing our management plans, if we know how long those plans are taking, we know good costs for those management plans using efficient and effective control methods. And we can use those methods on a site that we're working on, and we demonstrate good results. That in itself, and the Wyanosk Foundation and also Caerphilly County Council, their work shows that doing good work brings people into the project, the program. And I think ultimately it's easier to sell success. And I said that earlier. If we can do what we can on the land, there's always the chance that it's going to be reinvaded. But ultimately, if the site is clean at some point and you get reinvasion, it's still going to be sustainable in terms of its management, because you're going to be focusing on small areas that have been reinvaded instead of starting all over again using ineffective methods that ultimately the program ran out of money before they could be successfully completed.
Okay, we've had a couple of questions here along the same topic, but a question from Henry Bechelet. Given the extent and scale of the problems associated with both these weeds, why haven't IWM guidelines been produced?
I don't know. You know, it'd be useful to have good guidance for a range of these species. Because there is a bit of a vacuum around it. And I think, you know, one of the things that I always find surprising about all of this is the extent and the amount of labour that's gone into very limited local hand pulling operations. And you just think all that time and money and effort could have been spent a lot better undertaking much wider management of these species.
Okay, I know we covered this off earlier, but it's just worth drawing attention to again. This is from Christopher Portsmore. Am I right to believe hogweed is an irritant or toxic? And I think it goes back to the point of, do we need to make more notice of this so people are aware of it?
There's a number, without scaremongering, so giant hogweed is one of a number of the carrot family that have got furanocoumarins, if I pronounced that correctly. And these are like, they're chemical burns. It's not even an irritant. I've been burnt by it and it's a real blister. There's a huge issue with this, with people strimming it, but also strimming similar native species. And I didn't include pictures of blisters and burns because there's lots of them on the internet. But yeah, you really need to be careful around these species, and this is why I was saying don't use stem injection around giant hogweed, because yeah, you're just coming into contact with the plant. It's a health and safety risk.
Okay, and finally we've got time for one more question. Oh, there's a few questions coming in just at the end. Apologies, we might not get to those, but we'll try. This is from John Hanley again. Dan, you've kindly provided references within the presentations. Are these available after the presentation? Are they available to get?
Some of them are publicly accessible. If you have a crack at getting them, what I don't want to do is distribute them to you. Just send me an email.
Okay, no problem. We can provide information like that as well. Quickly, we'll try and squeeze these in. David Hackett, are there benefits of applying seed replacement plants after treatments to prevent bare ground and possible erosion?
Great question. Our PhD student, Sophie Hockin, is currently looking at this, and we're going to have some publications coming out this year on that topic. I would await Sophie's research, but certainly in the next few months, that's going to be publicly available, and that will be open access.
Okay, sadly, that's us out of time. Any questions that have been asked that we haven't got to, apologies. We will follow these up later, and we'll post a video of Dan and I asking these questions and covering off these answers later on, and you'll all be sent a link. It's now 12 o'clock. Thank you once again to Dan for sharing his wealth of knowledge and information on hogweed and Himalayan balsam, and thank you to everyone for attending. And please keep an eye out for the next webinar on the 21st, same time, same place, and an invite will be sent out to you following this presentation. Thank you once again and take care. Thank you. Bye-bye.